these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office. Experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
for insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all. In-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths.
With Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Hey everybody, welcome back, and we've got a very special episode today. We have with us Dr. Jonathan Haidt. He is a social psychologist at New York University's Stern School of Business. I've been looking at Dr. Haidt's work for quite a while. His book, The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion, is one of my personal favorites. And one of his newest books, The Coddling of the American Mind, How Good Intentions and Bad Ideas Are Setting Up a Generation for Failure. That was also co-authored by Greg Lukianoff. These are excellent books. I would highly recommend them. And Dr. Haidt's work on moral psychology and as it relates to business ethics is incredibly illuminating. He's also the co-founder of heterodoxacademy.org, a collaboration among nearly 2,500 professors who are working to increase viewpoint diversity and freedom of inquiry in universities. So, Dr. Haidt, thank you so much for being on the show.
Well, thanks so much, Dan, and please call me John.
John, well, I want to start with some current events. So right now we are in the midst of the coronavirus economic lockdown and worldwide pandemic. And you're going to have an interesting perspective on this. First of all, because you were quarantined, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And go ahead.
Oh, just I gave a talk at my old middle school. I'm really interested in what's happening to American teenagers, the rates of depression and anxiety, and so I agreed to give a talk at my old middle school where the principal invited me back. I graduated in 1978, and coincidentally, Scarsdale, New York, a town in Westchester, just north of New York City, there was one coronavirus case. A month ago. It was one of the early ones. And I happened to give a talk on, and sit at the table with that very teacher. So yeah, I had to spend 2 weeks in relative quarantine about 3 weeks ago.
But you're okay now. And here's a very general question. Just based on the approach that you generally take to problems, how is America reacting, and how is that tied to your research in moral psychology?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, so one of the big features of American politics and American society is that we have very rapidly rising political polarization since the late 1990s. And the key way to conceptualize that, political scientists talk about polarization in a lot of ways, but the key thing to keep your eye on is what's called affective polarization. That is emotional polarization. That is, how much do you hate the other side? And that has been rising steadily since the late 90s, and that defines all the weirdness and awfulness of our current politics, and a lot of our weakness compared to other countries. Is that we hate each other so much that we interpret that at least people who are politically active, or a lot of the political class, they'll interpret a national tragedy or a national challenge not in pragmatic terms of how do we solve it, but how can we blame the other side? How can we profit from this for our side? And that's exactly what James Madison worried about in Federalist 10. The founding fathers were so worried about faction. That's the word they used a lot in the Federalist Papers, mm-hmm. because they knew, writing in the 1780s, they knew that when men hate each other, they lose sight of the common good, and they think only, how can I get advantage over my enemies? And that opens us up to making to foreign influence. Anyway, it's all in there in the Federalist Papers and in George Washington's farewell speech, and we're falling right into the trap. So back to coronavirus.
Right. You're seeing that play out now.
Exactly. That's right. So I guess what I can contribute as a psychologist, as a social psychologist who studies morality, is that there are three really deep, interesting psychological systems that we inherit from our ancestors who faced threats to their survival constantly. And so one is foreign attack. Our ancestors for hundreds of thousands of years or millions of years lived in groups that competed with other groups. And when we're under attack, boy, do we come together. And that really happened after 9/11. So that's system number one. Mm-hmm. It brings us together. System number two is, what do we do when there's a disease, when there's a contagious disease? And our ancestors have been suffering from contagious diseases forever. And so we have all kinds of disgust at people who have sores or pus or signs of illness, and we move away from them. So we have a contagion response, and that drives us apart. And then we also have a shortage response because our ancestors were hungry most of the time. Sometimes there'd be a lot of food. Most of the time there'd be not enough. And sometimes for a month at a time, there'd be none. So we have this hoarding response when we think there's a shortage. So you put all this together, and what we see is it wasn't really an attack by foreigners, so we don't have that system going that brings us together. But we do have the contagion and the shortage mentality. So that both of those tend to drive people apart. Now, given that, I think we're actually doing pretty well. So, you see some of those reflexes, but overall, I think, America, there's a lot of stories of people helping each other, because the bottom line is that even though we're terribly divided, it is still shared adversity. We are all going through something together. And that's actually an encouraging thing, that we're actually going through this together with everyone in Europe and people in Asia. It is kind of a global experience. So it's very much in flux. I think so far we've seen much more positive than negative. What do you think about it?
Yeah, it's gotten better. That's what I would say. My initial observations were there was a lot of political opportunism, and I was very outspoken against that. I think it's gotten better, but it's still there, and frankly, will probably never go away. The next big battle is going to be over. What are the solutions from an economic standpoint? What are the solutions? And that should be a debate, of course. I mean, I have different ideas than my own Republican colleagues, and they have very different ideas than the Democrats. That's fine. That is what our job is to debate those things. What our job should not be is to be casting blame and then celebrating when things go wrong. That's the real gross.
That's horrible.
That's
the
grossest part of it all.
Yes, and it's interesting that you use the word gross, because I study disgust. A lot of my early research was on the emotion of disgust, and the fact that we have this disgust reflex for dead bodies and excrement. We use the word disgust for all those things that smell bad, but we also use it for a certain subset of emotions. And when people take a national tragedy and try to make money from it or turn it to their advantage, there's something gross about it.
You know what's and this is jumping a little bit ahead when we would talk about your book, The Righteous Mind, where you identify 5 pillars of morality, and one of those is that sense of sanctity or sense of disgust. And I'm curious if you have a take on this, which is in America, we know that the virus came from a combination of perhaps snakes and bats. Okay.
Oh, yeah. Right.
These are things that we would never, I don't think that I was ever taught not to like those things. Right. That's just part of that's just how I feel. I don't like them. I don't want to eat those things.
Yep.
So can you talk about the evolution of that? Like, why is it that in Asian countries they do, and that's considered a delicacy, but here in America it's not?
Oh boy, that's a fascinating question. I'll try to not be too professorial and lectury on this, but
that's why we brought you on.
Okay, all right. So disgust is a really, really interesting emotion, because if you think about it as a defense of the mouth against pathogens, against bacteria and things that get into our digestive system and make us sick, it makes a lot of sense. So there's what we call core disgust, which is a guardian of the mouth, and it focuses on food and contaminants. So it makes sense that rats and cockroaches are disgusting, whereas, say, bunny rabbits and ants are not particularly disgusting. They're not as disgusting. Mm-hmm. So things that hang around garbage piles, they are disease vectors. They brought germs to our ancestors, so we're disgusted by them. But snakes aren't like that, yet they're creepy. There's a bunch of different kinds of disgust. There's subtypes of disgust. And animals that don't fit neatly into any category are often taboo. So if you look around the world at traditional societies, they almost always taboo some animals. So I'm Jewish. The Hebrew Bible has all kinds of taboos on animals that you must not eat. Most societies have taboos. And there was an anthropologist named Mary Douglas who observed that things that don't fit into a category are especially likely to creep us out. They're especially likely to to elicit taboo, which is related to disgust. And so if you think about it, I mean, snakes, what are they? They're actually vertebrates just like us, and I think they have tiny little legs inside because they once had legs. But snakes, they move in a weird way. So even though they're no disease threat, they have a special power, and you see that. It's not always negative. They're very powerful in myths and in religions. And then bats, what on earth are those? They're like mice that fly. Like, what are they? So it does make sense that bats and snakes would creep us out. Until you mentioned that, I kind of forgot about the bats and snakes' origin. I don't know that the origin of it in disgusting animals translates all the way through to what we feel now. It's an interesting hypothesis, and I suppose if you pointed it out to, that would be a fascinating experiment. You ask people how creeped out they are by walking near a person who has COVID, but then in half the cases you tell them COVID, a virus that came from snakes and bats, versus COVID, a virus that came from an animal market or something more general, and maybe there'd be some residual disgust effect.
Yeah, I mean, I was wondering more of how is it that Americans don't consider these things good things to eat, but other cultures do, and like you said, it sounds like it's more of just a traditional cultural issue, because you're right, they don't fall directly into those really gross things like a cockroach. I mean, God, I can't even think about that.
Yeah. Well, no, but okay. So in terms of eating, I think the rule is this, that cultures vary in how food positive they are. That is, in America, we are not very food positive. What I mean is any animal is kind of off limits or taboo unless it's a cow, pig, horse, not horse, oops, sorry. Cow, pig, chicken, a couple others, or fish. We're very picky, whereas China is notoriously not picky, and especially so they, and the French, for example, France is the French versus the British. We're more British in our style. The British found it disgusting that the French eat frogs, and so they that was their term for them was frogs. The French are frogs. So we're more British in our uptight food sensibilities, and the French and the Chinese, I think, have more fun with food.
So I want to go back to because you mentioned Madison and Federalist 10 and the issue with factions, and that is applicable to today's conversation. You wrote about that in your article in The Atlantic. What year was that?
The Atlantic article where I wrote about Madison, that was last November.
Okay, so fairly recently. And that article was called "The Dark Psychology of Social Networks: Why It Feels Like Everything Is Going Haywire." It kind of feels like you could also write that right now, and it would be some useful lessons in there. And what was interesting when I read that part about Federalist 10, which was the founders had some security in believing that our sense of checks and balances would prevent an overly emotional faction from radically changing the direction of the country. I think that is still true, and I think it's unbelievably important. Frankly,
yes.
I don't think 51% of the population should be able to tell the other 49% what to do. When people talking about packing the Supreme Court or removing the Electoral College, that worries me a great deal for that exact reason, because ultimately what we're getting at is, hey, if we can just get to 51%, we can tell the other side exactly what to do, and that scares the hell out of me.
No, that's right.
But the other thing you noted was that the other reason Madison wasn't so fearful of the factions was because it's hard. It would be in his time, they could imagine a lot of things in the future. I don't think they imagined the way we communicate so effectively with the internet and social media. And so he thought to himself, well, it's too hard for people to communicate so quickly that they could they could create a movement just like that. Of course, we know that's not true anymore. You can do that on social media, and so how does that pertain to today? What would you rewrite from that article and that analysis today?
No, that's right, exactly. That's the key section here to focus on in Federalist 10. So I've been really interested in in why we're coming apart. I've been studying rising polarization since around 2008. And I came across a quote from the Federalist Papers in an essay by a Princeton professor, Sam Wang, originally a couple of years ago, and it really stayed with me. Let me see if I can find it in our article here. And it's so the basic insight that is somewhere in the Federalist Papers is that there's a long section in Federalist 10 where they talk about whether it's better to have a large republic or small one. And because the founders, a lot of people don't seem to realize this, the founders did not particularly like democracy. They read Plato, they read the history that they had available to them, and there's a line in there where Madison says that direct democracies have ever been as as violent in their deaths as they've been short in their lives, something like that.
Yeah.
And so they deliberately set out to contain the explosiveness and the instability of democracy. And so there's a section where they meditate. This one is written by Madison. He meditates on, well, actually, being a really, really large country, because even though they were, the 13 colonies plus whatever else had joined by then, it was very large compared to ancient Greece or Britain or anything else. So, if it's a very large country, well, somebody might start a fire in one place, or there might be some spark that ignites in one place. But by the time the news of this gets from Georgia to Maine, it will have had so much time to cool down. Oh my God! You read that and you think, oh, that's what we're depending on, is the slowness of transmission, and so. And so that was really the takeoff point for this Atlantic article, which I wrote with my friend Tobias Rose Stockwell, who really understands the guts of social media, and which I don't. But we teamed up to write this article, and it was, I'll just share with you. So the metaphor that we used to open it, because this has just been on my mind for years. Something has changed. Something is weird about American democracy, and it's not just us. It's happening in other countries too. And it started around 2014 or 2015. So you can't blame this on Donald Trump. It started before he came on the scene. And so the metaphor that we use in the article is, suppose one day God was bored and he said, just for fun, let's double the gravitational constant. I've been watching this universe spinning around, expanding for 14 billion years. I'm kind of bored. Let's just change a parameter. Let's double the force of gravity everywhere in the universe. What would happen? It would be instant chaos. Planes would fall from the sky. Clocks would start working incorrectly. Like anything that had movement would start screwing up. And that's what it has felt like to me these last few years. And so we try to say, well, what is that thing? What is the thing that changed? And the answer, and I didn't know this when I started writing this, the answer is that social media fundamentally changed between 2009 and 2012. It's that specific. It's not that social media is intrinsically bad. Originally Facebook, or the Facebook, was just like, here's my page, here are the bands that I like, here are my friends. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But it's that when Facebook added the like button, and now you got a lot of information and people are training each other, and Twitter added the retweet button, and now anything can go viral. And then they both algorithmicize, they start applying algorithms. And now everybody's trying to game the system and make their content go viral, and outrage spreads, outrage pays, lighting a fire gets you attention, and boy, is this system set up to spread fires. So that's our conclusion, that Facebook, social media in its original forms, 2005 through 2008, were not particularly toxic. But between 2009 and 2012, they radically changed, and they gave us a system that we think is very, very bad for democracy.
That seems accurate to me as well. Just being in politics, where it's right in front of me all the time. I probably tend to think it's worse than it really is. I also read books like yours, and they scared the hell out of me too. So, but it's one reason Instagram recently took away. They didn't take away the like button, but they made it so that you can't see how many likes.
Counter.
Right? Yeah. So you can't see how many people have.
You can't easily see. You can still find out, but it's not right there in front of you.
Right.
And there, I believe that was more for the teen mental health problem.
Exactly.
So I'm really concerned about two problems with social media. One is the democracy problem we were just talking about, in which it spreads outrage and undercuts trust in each other and institutions. The other is the teen mental health problem, because teenagers, especially teen girls, suddenly become a lot more depressed and anxious beginning in 2012, 2013. And the rates just go up and up, and they're still rising. So yes, Facebook and Instagram, I should say. I've spoken with the people there. I do believe that they care about this. I do believe that they are looking for ways that they can make the platform more helpful and less toxic. But they have been experimenting with hiding the like counters, that if a girl posts a picture of herself and nobody likes it, she still is going to be embarrassed, but at least her shame is not exposed to the whole world to see.
Yeah, and frankly, I can't see any reason to be against a policy like that. We're pretty much on the subject of your book, The Coddling of the American Mind, right now. So we're just going to stick to that line of conversation. Sure. Because it's a great book. And one thing you mentioned, which is a lack of, as you were just talking just now, you said we're losing trust in our institutions. In The Coddling of the American Mind, you also talk about victimhood quite a bit, the sort of ideology of victimhood, what it means, what it doesn't mean, social justice. One of the things that I observed, again, in my own writing, is that this victimhood mentality has led to the lack of trust in our institutions, because if you are a victim, then you must have an oppressor. And that oppressor might be somebody individually at first, but then it has to grow. It grows into a group, and this gets into the identity politics, this sort of group-on-group power dynamic. But then that turns into institutions, and I worry greatly that it's one cause for us losing our institutions. Of course, I didn't actually set up the book, The Coddling of the American Mind, so maybe you want to describe that too as you respond to what I just said.
Sure. Yeah, we'll ease listeners into it. So the book begins with the observation by my friend Greg Lukianoff. He's the president of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, which has been arguing for free speech rights for college students since the 1990s. And it's always been the case that administrators are wary of threats of legal liability. They don't want students to say something that could lead to bad publicity. So they're often creating these free speech zones and say, oh, you can say whatever you want over, in that corner of the parking lot or something. Well, free speech zone. I mean, we have First Amendment rights wherever we go. So FIRE was created to push back on a lot of these regulations against college students. And Greg observed something very strange beginning in 2013, 2014. Now that will relate to the social media thing but we didn't know it at the time. We just knew that something weird was happening on college campuses beginning in 2014, which is that college students were, for the first time, they were the ones who were asking for the restrictions. Greg came to me in May of 2014. He came to see me. He said, John, something weird is happening. We're finding college students asking that books be banned, taken out of the syllabus, requests for trigger warnings. If a professor is going to speak about Greek mythology, there should be a trigger warning, because like almost all mythology, there's rape in almost the mythology of every society. It seems there's sexual violence, and some students were saying, "Well, you can't just have us read that without preparing us for it." And a lot of us were like, "What? What do you mean? It's fiction. It's literature." Mm-hmm. Anyway, so Greg was puzzled by this, and Greg noticed that the reasons that students were giving were the exact reasons that he had learned to stop giving himself when Greg was treated for depression, when he learned cognitive behavioral therapy. So Greg had a terrible depression in 2007. He nearly killed himself. And when he was released from the hospital, he learned a very powerful psychological technique called cognitive behavioral therapy, where you learn to recognize that your thoughts are catastrophizing, black and white thinking, overgeneralizing. Now, these are all really bad habits of thinking. They're exactly the sorts of things we should be weeding out on a college campus when we try to teach you to think critically. But students were saying, if this conservative speaker is allowed to come speak on campus and spew his hate, there will be bodies in the street. There will be, people will be marginalized and dead. Yeah. So it was catastrophizing. And Greg's theory was that somehow on college campuses, we were teaching students to think in this way. And I think his suspicion was like yours, that in certain parts of the university, when they teach this victimhood culture, if you teach 18, 19-year-old students to think this way, you actually make them depressed. You make them disempowered. Mm-hmm. And that was the original working title of our book, was Disempowered. So Greg came to this theory. We wrote it up in an article for The Atlantic in 2015, and we couldn't really find strong evidence that students were depressed. We were hearing stories about the rise of depression, but there wasn't good data then. So the article comes out in August of 2015, and for those of your listeners who are aware of the chronology, when Nicholas Christakis, when his wife at Yale sent out a letter about Halloween costumes, there was this big blow up at Yale, students protesting over this letter about whether the university should regulate Halloween costumes, and the protest went national. So our article came out in August, and just a couple months later, everything blew up. And Greg and I followed this, and we learned a lot more about it. And we realized wow, it's not that colleges were making students depressed. What we later learned is that Gen Z, that is, students who were born in 1996 and later, are the most depressed generation in history. They're much more depressed than the millennials, depressed and anxious. And they began arriving on college campuses in 2013 or 2014, and things blow up in 2015. Now, there's a lot of other causes. It's not just because Gen Z arrived. It's not the student protests are not driven by depression. I'm not saying that, but there are a whole bunch of factors that came together. And social media was one of them. It was that change in social media, so that anybody who claims victimhood, anybody who wants to tell a story, now can spread that story very, very quickly. And of course, here what we're saying, all of this is pointing much more at problems on the left. They're equivalent. They're not necessarily symmetrical, but social media has driven everyone crazy. It's made everybody reactive, and there are movements from the right as well that that have made it difficult on campus. So I'm just saying, it's like, we're a moralistic species. We're quick to anger, we're quick to judge, and social media has made us all much quicker to judge without evidence, and it's making it very difficult to run anything.
Yeah, that mob mentality is definitely made much easier by social media. I've been a victim of it on the left and the right. So I do agree.
You must be doing something right. Yeah.
It's a different kind of problem on the right, but it's similar. Because being a conservative, I obviously come with certain biases, but I want to be honest about the overall arching problems of our culture. One thing I wonder, and what I think you found in your book, was that this was mostly a problem on elite institutions on the coasts. Mm-hmm. So it's really hard to argue that these kids are indeed victimized in a real sort of way. I'm not saying they're not. I'm not saying that their complaints aren't valid. Okay, just for Media Matters when they listen to my podcast. I'm just saying it's highly unlikely. It's much more likely that kids going to community college have actually had some real hardship in their lives, and may actually have a victim story to tell. And yet they're not the ones protesting. They're not the ones feeling anxiety. They're actually holding another job while they do classes and taking care of their kid. So.
That's right.
What the heck is going on here? Is there like a psychological need for us to be the champion of the oppressed if we're not oppressed ourselves?
Okay, so there's a lot going on here. So the first thing is, let me bring in a concept from the righteous mind. The righteous mind is based on three principles. There are three principles of moral psychology. So the first is intuitions come first, strategic reasoning second, meaning we're not really that rational. We go with our gut feelings. And groups and political movements are very good at triggering those gut feelings. The second principle is there's more to morality than harm and fairness. Mm-hmm. Now, on the left, they tend to focus on harm and fairness as the basis of morality. On the right, across countries, what I found in my research is that conservatives tend to have a broader moral palette, you might say. Yeah. Conservatives, of course, they value fairness and care for their children and the vulnerable, but they also seem more keenly receptive to issues related to group loyalty, respect for authority and traditions, and a sense of sanctity or purity. So that's the basic left-right split over most of our culture war issues.
And we'll get more into that, just for the listeners. We're going to get more into that as soon as we're done with the conversation about coddling of the American mind.
Okay, but people on the left, especially when they reduce morality down to a focus on care for the vulnerable. Well, what could be wrong with that? You'd think caring for the vulnerable, that could only be good. But as Aristotle told us long ago, any virtue carried to extremes becomes a vice. So if you have a moral community in which you're totally focused on the vulnerable, the victims, and you're willing to get rid of everything else, nothing else matters, rights don't matter, authority, tradition, none of this matters. All that matters is the victims that we're caring for. Well, then your movement is coherent in a way, and you all circle around that sacred value. But if you're circling around a sacred value, you kind of go blind. You kind of lose sight of a lot of other things that matter. And that's something that it can only happen when you have a bunch of students all living together and creating their own moral matrix. So like the movie The Matrix, which is defined as a consensual hallucination. If your student's up at Middlebury College in central Vermont, you have a bunch of 18 to 21-year-old, generally, wealthy, left-leaning students sequestered in the woods in central Vermont. They can invent a fantastical moral world and live in it. And in that world, everything is racist, everything is oppressive, everything is whatever, it can be anything. Whereas if you're a community college student, in Detroit or Phoenix, and you go home to your parents, your grandparents at night, and you just take classes during the day, there's no way you could create a fantastical world. Everybody would laugh at you. And so if you start saying, I need a trigger warning because we were assigned The Great Gatsby, and there's a scene where I forget what the character's name is. He punches the woman in the face. Like, well, I can't be expected to read that. That's violence against women. Like, everyone's going to just laugh at you. Mm-hmm. So that's why it only happens at residential colleges that are fairly non-diverse ideologically. And so that's why it's in the Northeast and along the West Coast. Now, there's also some in the Midwest, like Oberlin College and some in Chicago. So if you look at where speakers are being shouted down and where there was actual violence, there wasn't a lot of violence, but where there was, it's almost all in the Northeast or right along the Pacific Coast, like there's a bunch in Washington State and Oregon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wonder if there's a lack of perspective too, because the difference I pointed out was some people have had real hardship in their lives, and some people have really haven't, just relatively speaking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And does that play into how you react to these sort of microaggressions?
Well, in general, facing hardship makes you tougher. It's like the Princess and the Pea. If you've been spared from hardship, mm-hmm. then somebody putting a pea 20 mattresses down, you can't sleep on such an uncomfortable bed. So there is a bit of that. But I would actually, I'm developing a way of thinking about this. Or I'm trying to develop a way of explaining it. So I'll give it a try here. If you think about what we find intolerable or what we find offensive in our group or our community, there are two things to look at. One is some degree of actual reality. So if we take racism, how much racism is there at Yale, and how much racism is there at, say, Auburn, in Alabama? If you were to count up the number of racist jokes or something, some measure, if you had some objective measure, my guess is there'd be a lot less at Yale. Just the nature of the culture is very anti-racist. So my guess is there's
mm-hmm.
less. But that's only one piece of the puzzle. The other thing is, what is the social construction of reality? What is the moral matrix that we live in? And if you have a moral matrix that is so anti-racist that it is really focused on finding microaggressions, on interpreting any outcome difference as caused by structural racism.
Right.
So these are useful terms. I'm not saying that there's no meaning to those terms.
Right.
But what I'm saying is the framework that you use to understand can get anti-racist faster than the reality. So that even though Yale surely has less racism, it could be the case that a Black student or an LGBTQ student at Yale might find it more offensive than one somewhere in the Deep South, which isn't so focused on fighting racism and sexism.
Right. They
and
see it. They see it wherever they look, and they also, it's like Thomas Sowell's book, Discriminations and Disparities, or maybe it's Disparities and Discriminations. But the point is that nobody's asking the question, is there a disparity with a good logical reason behind that, or is it true discrimination? Is there a true injustice happening here? Mm-hmm. Are we defining the term justice correctly? You write about that in your book as well.
That's right. That's it. That's the question to ask. So all Americans support justice. Everybody does. And there is a version of justice here which is very widely supported, which is equal opportunity. And so if you're talking about on the left or the right, everybody supports equal opportunity, although the left and the right tend to differ on how much should the state help to equalize starting conditions. And that's a legitimate political debate. How much should we equalize spending on education? Those are all legitimate debates between left and right. But yes, there's a shifting definition of justice on some parts of the left where they've shifted recently to not equal opportunity, which is deeply American, but to equal outcomes, which is not deeply American. That is the idea that the state needs to guarantee that we all end up with the same amount. I don't think there's any trace of that in the founding fathers or in Lincoln.
No. It's pursue your happiness, not happiness. It's pursue your happiness.
That's right. You're guaranteed.
That's a very careful word.
Yeah, that's right. And so there is this shift, which I think leads to a lot of conflict. Because if you insist on equal outcomes, well, that means that people who work harder and achieve more must be stopped. That would be unfair to let them end up with more. So I'm not saying that this is generally what the left believes. It is, and most people everywhere in America believe in equal opportunity and that you should reward hard work. But at least on college campuses, you get there's a sort of, well, I guess you could say the Bernie Sanders left. You get, the left right now is divided between more like the Joe Biden, more moderate Barack Obama left. Like as Bill Clinton said, it was a very winning formula for him. It was, if you work hard, what was his formulation? I believe if you work hard and play by the rules, you should get ahead.
Yeah.
And that's, that's
a conservative
what I believe.
Could say, yeah, and a conservative could probably say that as well.
Yeah, that's right. That's deeply American. And I think most Democrats believe that. But there is a movement on the left that is much more of a European style, egalitarianism that says if it's not equal outcomes, then it's racism or sexism or something.
Right. Exactly. And that's the key point there is the redefinition of the word justice and this notion that if there is a different outcome, then it must be due to an injustice. One of my favorite examples from, again, the Thomas Sowell book, is his example of children who are firstborn. So firstborn children, if you look at their outcomes, dramatically outperform their siblings, and who knows why. But the point is they're more likely to be a member of Congress. They're more likely to be an astronaut. I mean, dramatically more likely. It's not a small statistical difference. And so you have to ask the question and he asked that question, which is if we can't expect the same outcomes from people who had almost the exact same life, then how could we be so sure of the same outcomes for everyone else? And this gets to the second moral pillar that you brought up earlier, which is fairness, which we all agree that that fairness is a part of our moral compass. The question is how do we define that fairness? And in your book, now I'm just drew a blank here. But
the righteous mind, Coddling the American mind.
Sorry. In the righteous mind, you draw a distinction between proportional fairness and egalitarian fairness, and that's an important point.
That's right. Yeah. That if one resolution of this is to go deep psychologically and say what are the tools in our head that we use to judge fairness. And so in the book with Greg Lukianoff, we go into how there's distributive justice and procedural justice. And they're a little different, but as long as you perceive that people are getting in proportion to what they're giving. And so, people who work harder or produce more of value should end up with more rewards. That's proportionality. And then procedural justice is the process is fair. Nobody's been able to bribe it or tilt it in their favor. Everybody got their say. And so as long as you have a system that produces both procedural and distributive justice, well, that's pretty darn good. And at that point, you'd have to say the system is fair. So that's a kind of fairness that I think is widely supported. And any political party that goes against that, any political party that says, no, fairness is equal outcomes. And so we use the example in the book of the UVA men's crew team. I used to teach at the University of Virginia. I really loved teaching there. And every fall, we would get flyers in our mailbox from I thought it was the men's crew team, but I didn't realize there is no UVA men's crew team. It was the Virginia Men's Rowing Association, something like that. And the reason there's no crew team is that Title IX, which began with good intentions to create equal opportunity for women in sports, was reinterpreted in the 1990s to require equal outcomes in sports. And so if a university has a lot more young men on its sports teams than young women, well, that can't be right. That must be sexism. And so the Justice Department began enforcing this or putting pressure on schools that they were at risk of prosecution or of investigation if they didn't have the same number of men and women, and if they didn't spend the same amount. Now, you can't possibly spend the same amount on women's sports if you have a football and basketball program, because those are hugely, there's vast amounts of money there. But they had to do what they could to push off any men's sports teams that were sort of marginal and to ramp up, including with forgery, the rosters of women's sports. So there's a lot of dishonesty that comes when you try to, jigger the system to make it look like you have equal outcomes.
Well, this whole
so just the point is just that it was just unfair that the UVA, if you were a young man and you wanted to row crew, you had to do yard work for professors and everyone else in order to raise the money to buy your boats. Whereas if you were the women's crew team, everything was paid for, and they were thrilled to have you because they wanted to get more women rowers. So that's the point. It's just most of us believe that you should treat individuals fairly, not groups. That you shouldn't make individuals pay or treat them badly to achieve some sort of cosmic justice, as Thomas Sowell puts it.
Yeah, and that conversation about men and women's sports has become infinitely more complicated than since even I think you wrote about that crew team, because now the debate is over whether men who identify as women can be on a women's sports team.
Yeah.
And is that fair? I mean, that's a deep moral question. Is that fair? I would say no, it's not fair. Of course, it's not fair. You can't, you just can't do that.
Yeah, that topic, that's one that is so taboo. I long ago made a resolution that I would just never even talk about it. There are certain taboos.
Smart.
It's just, nothing good can come from me talking about that.
Yeah, I can. But okay, so
Okay.
but I won't press you on it then. And we don't have a lot of time left, so I want to move on to The Righteous Mind. One of my favorite books, the Leadership Institute, which it's actually it's required reading.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, it's and the reason and that's for conservatives, right? They train conservatives. Now, your book is not written for conservatives by any means. In fact,
I wrote it for liberals originally.
Yeah, exactly. You wrote it because you thought Democrats needed to be talking about morality in a more coherent way. And so I guess I'll just let you take it from there. I mean, how did this book start? And let's review those 5 pillars once again, what they mean, and I'll let you take it from there.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I was always on the left from the time I was in college. I went to Yale as an undergrad, and I grew up in the New York area, and I ran a gun control group, and I was a pretty prototypical, left-leaning progressive throughout my 20s and 30s. And
but you don't really identify as a staunch conservative now, just to be clear, right?
Oh no, I'm not. I'm not a conservative. I'm on no team. I'm a social scientist, and I think that social scientists who study this stuff should really try to be nonpartisan. We really should not be on teams if we're studying the nature of these teams, frankly. So I'm non-political. It doesn't mean I don't have views about political issues. I do, but I don't work for any team. I don't take money or consult for any team.
Right. Just wanted to make that clear for everybody.
Okay, but I started the book. So in 2000, I couldn't believe that George W. Bush won, and I thought Al Gore should have won, and I blamed it on Al Gore. I mean, in that he didn't make good moral arguments, and he kept saying, my plan will put money in a lockbox, and it was all about appeals to self-interest. And American religion at the local level is a lot about self-interest, but at the presidential level, it's more like a religion. And I thought that the Republicans, especially since Reagan, have been much better at appealing to that sort of religious sense of Americanness and what's special about America, shining city on a hill with a role to play in history.
And that divide has gotten even more pronounced since then. If I were to make an observation,
I would say that. Reagan was the best at it. Clinton could do it at times. He could rise to the occasion, and Obama could also really do it.
Also
and
agree.
I don't think that President Trump has he's had moments here and there, but but those seem to be moments that his speechwriters wrote for him. I think he's been very bad at this, especially in times of national crisis. But anyway, so I wrote. So I was upset that Al Gore had no idea how to talk about American morality. The Democrats had no idea. And then when Bush won again in 2004, I thought, I can't stand this. John Kerry also had no idea how to talk about this. So I'm going to actually start using my research to help Democrats make better moral arguments. And I was a professor at UVA, and I now see that I think that's inappropriate. Like I should not have used my professional abilities to help one political party. I mean, it's certainly a legal thing to do, but I think it's a violation of professional ethics. At least now I think that. But that's what I set out to do originally in my research. And And I gave a TED talk on this, laying out my research. And around that time, I signed a deal to write a book, which became the Righteous Mind. And to write the book, I committed to really understanding conservatives. I had spent some time in anthropology with my postdoc advisor at the University of Chicago, Richard Schwader, and I really admired anthropologists who just can immerse themselves in someone else's moral world and interpret it for us. And so that's what I set out to do. And actually, beginning around 2004 or 5, I began watching Fox News, subscribed to National Review, talking to conservatives whenever I could. And what I found is that I learned things. I saw things I'd never thought of, that you can't understand anything complicated until you get people to criticize your views. I learned so much. I began to really love listening to conservatives and reading their ideas. And that's when I found Thomas Sowell, Conflict of Visions, that book. Boy, is that book powerful. I signed that in my UVA classes. And at that point, in a sense, I stepped out of the matrix. That is, I sort of dropped the partisan stuff, like I've got to help the Democrats win. It was more like, oh my God, our country is coming apart and we're all lost in illusion and we don't understand each other. And so the book very quickly became not a partisan book, but a book about how to understand and be more tolerant. It doesn't mean you have to accept everything, but don't demonize the people. That's the main thing. Don't demonize the voters on the other side. Mm-hmm. Try to understand them. They're your fellow citizens, and they surely are right about some things that you can't even imagine. So that's what the book did to me. So I'm glad to hear that it's assigned to conservatives. It tends to be popular center left, center right, libertarians, and actually religious people. I find a lot of evangelicals, Mormons like it. It's unpopular on the far left, and I suppose on the far right. Maybe people don't know it. I don't know, but I'm glad to hear that you found it useful.
Yeah, I don't think it's unpopular anywhere on the right. They probably don't know it, perhaps. But to your point, the reason it's popular among conservatives is because I think it clarifies, and I think the study of psychology in general clarifies kind of what we already know, but it puts it into terms that we can then explain and formulate. And I think that's an important thing that psychology as a general academic study does. It's one of the reasons I enjoy the study of psychology, because it kind of tells you what you already know about yourself and your interactions. And sometimes it tells you stuff you really didn't know, but oftentimes it just helps you articulate it. And conservatives know why they know they're wired a certain way and they feel a certain way, but oftentimes they're unsure how to articulate it. Liberals have a much easier time articulating it because it really is about caring and fairness, about fighting injustice, right? They can rattle that off very quickly. And so I spend a lot of time reading books like yours, trying to articulate exactly why we are, as conservatives, why we are the way we are. And your book does that in a very clear way, at least for the moral foundations aspect of it, which, by the way, leads to everything else. I often extrapolate policies from your moral foundations to help people understand where we're coming from. You know, like, why did I arrive at this? Is it because I'm a bad person? Do you really think I'm a bad person? Or do you think maybe that we do operate off a broader set of moral foundations? And so if you could just repeat what those are real quick, and then let's dive into them for the limited time we have.
Okay, sure. So the idea of the moral foundations is that cultures vary in their morality, but it's not random. Like if you read profiles of other societies, they're doing things that are kind of similar to what we do, but also kind of different. And so what I did was with my friend Craig Joseph, we read through a lot of anthropological literature, and we noted what are the kinds of things you see all over the place. And then we read through the evolutionary literature. What are the theories that are out there about how human nature evolved? And so a good example is care. We're mammals. We have this attachment system that makes us very sensitive to the suffering of our own offspring, but we apply it to other offspring and other things that are cute, like puppies and kittens. So we have clearly something built in that makes us responsive to suffering, especially when it looks like the suffering of a child. And that's a foundation of morality. You find it all over the world. Some moralities can sort of say, well, that's not so important, like the Spartans or the Nazis, or there are other moral systems that prioritize strength and that made weakness or compassion they made compassion a weakness, but those are very rare. So care is a universal aspect of just being a mammal, and it becomes a part of our morality. Fairness or reciprocity or exchange, you find this in every society, and there's a lot of evolutionary thinking about playing tit for tat, or being able to trade favors and insults. Group loyalty is the third foundation. We evolved in groups, and those groups were always competing with other groups, and so we hate people who are disloyal, who betray us.
Mm-hmm.
Authority versus subversion is the fourth foundation. We're hierarchical, like most primates. Chimpanzees and gorillas, many other primates, have hierarchy, and we're very sensitive to proper behavior. If you're too informal with one of your superiors, other people might be shocked, unless it's a very egalitarian culture, in which case they might not like you being too formal with others. So there's some variability, but we all have within us the capacity to recognize respect for authority.
Mm-hmm.
And then the last one is sanctity or purity versus degradation. And it's the idea that some things have a sacred essence. It doesn't make sense materially. It's not practical. And we can see that most clearly, obviously, with the religious symbols. And so there was an artist, Andres Serrano, who had these famous photographs of Piss Christ. It was a crucifix submerged in his own urine. And the image is actually quite beautiful because it glows a golden yellow. I mean, it's visually beautiful, but it's disgusting to think about.
Mm-hmm.
And for some people, especially on the left, who didn't take the crucifix seriously, it was an interesting mix of aesthetic reactions, and that's great art. But for many, it was deeply offensive. You can see it with the flag. Is the flag just a piece of cloth? Well, for many on the left, it is just a piece of cloth. But especially for those who've been in the service, or for conservatives more generally, no, it stands for the country. It should be protected from touching the ground. So we treat it with a kind of a religious sensibility. And what I found in my research in the United States in particular is that the left-right split that we've had recently, this was not true in 100 years ago, but the left-right split since the new left of the 1960s has been much more sort of social conservatives in one party, increasingly in the Republican Party, and social progressives in the Democratic Party. And whenever you look at any culture war issue, and if you just keep your eye on those three foundations of loyalty, authority, and sanctity, those are the ones that conservatives build more on. They care more about than progressives do.
And
it's not the key to the culture war.
And it's not that they care more about them than caring and fairness. It's just that it's
about
equal, right? It's like conservatives look at all of the foundations about the same, right? We derive some morality from all five, but liberals tend to look at just the first two.
Yeah, to be a little more specific, because in terms of the scores on our scale, yes, what you say is true. And so if your listeners go to yourmorals.org, just YOURMORALS, yourmorals.org, they can take our Moral Foundations questionnaire, and they'll see their scores in the foundations. And then, yes, what you said is true. The scores will be fairly similar across the five foundations. Now, if you actually look at daily life, how much of daily life is about group loyalty versus fairness? Not much. That is, daily life is much more about fairness when we're dealing with strangers and other people. And siblings. I have two kids. They're always fighting about what's fair. So fairness and care tend to predominate. It's really when you look at political disagreements, fairness tends to be still the most important. But that's where you tend to get more left-right difference over loyalty, authority, sanctity.
The other interesting thing that you do on that website was you have people take that survey, and I guess they self-identify as a liberal or conservative, and then you ask them to answer how would somebody on the other side of the aisle answer that question.
Mm-hmm.
If you're a conservative, how would a liberal answer that question? So what were your results from that?
Okay. It was that, so we did this study, and we invited people to take the survey, and 1/3 were assigned to pretend that they were a liberal, and 1/3 were assigned to pretend that they were a conservative, and 1/3 were assigned to just take it as themselves. And what we found is that people who come to the site and say that they're a centrist, they're the most accurate. Conservatives were pretty close. They were the next most accurate. liberals were less accurate, and by far the most inaccurate were the people on the far left. So on a 7-point scale, it was really the people who say that they are very liberal. They're the ones who were least accurate in guessing what conservatives would say.
Yeah.
And the way we interpreted it is, if you're a conservative and you grow up in the United States, you know what liberals think. You can't reach the age of 21
constantly.
Well, yeah. I mean, if you've seen you've seen Hollywood movies, you can't possibly, unless your parents shelter you in the basement, you can't possibly not know what liberals think. But if you grow up, as I did in the suburbs of New York City, or if you're in San Francisco, or a lot of places, you could reach adulthood and have no idea what conservatives think.
I've met many of those
so
adults.
I think but yeah, that's right. So I do think that the right tends to understand the left better than the left understands the right.
Yeah, in my own personal experience, that's absolutely true. I'm amazed by my conversations sometimes when there's a very well-intentioned liberal who genuinely wants to understand how I think, to watch them listen to me, and that they've truly never heard anybody articulate or formulate the conservative reasoning before. And it kind of baffles me, because I know exactly what their response to what I'm about to say is. I know exactly what it is, and I predict it 100% at the time. Now, granted, I went to liberal universities, whatever. I guess I lived in the bubble. Why? Here's a question. I want to be respectful of your time, so you can cut me off at any time.
Okay. Yeah, we have to stop in 5 minutes, but let's
great.
Let's keep going.
So, well, then here's a final question, which is, why does it matter which moral foundations we care about as it pertains to structuring a society, and I would guess as it pertains to the sustainability of a society? So, does it matter that liberals only really focus on caring and fairness, and why should we care about all five?
Yeah, so in a funny way, we can actually appeal to a lot of what gets written about diversity and the benefits of diversity. Like I'm on the big five personality. Like, I'm an introvert, high on conscientiousness, relatively low on neuroticism. Would I want everyone to be like me? No, of course not. It'd be a weird society if we all had the same personality. And just as we like to talk about the benefits of a variety of kinds of diversity, I think there is some benefit to moral diversity. Now, of course, if we really don't have similar morals at all, it's hard to have a coherent polity, we need to have some things in common.
Yeah.
But if you look at it this way, if you accept what I say in chapter 11 and 12, I review the evidence on how politics and morality is actually pretty heritable. And if you have an identical, you, Dan, if you had an identical twin and you were separated at birth, my guess is that identical twin would be a conservative too, even if raised in a different family. Our temperaments lead us to prefer one side of the aisle or the other. But think about it like this. Would you want the military and the police, the people who go into those fields, to be the same as the people who go into advertising and mathematics and art? There are different virtues, and different professions require different virtues. And for one side of the aisle, for one side of the political spectrum, to say everybody should have our virtues and only our virtues, that would be so self-destructive. So I think that that moral differences can be productive if they play out within a circle in which we either respect each other or at least grant each other basic legitimacy and decency. And I think that's where the greatest generation why we think of it as the greatest generation is going through World War II together. They were bound together so tightly that when there were differences, they never questioned whether the other people were still Americans. They had that experience. That kept them all in the same circle, and then they could have their disagreements. And famously, Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill could argue bitterly during the day and then have a drink together at night. And so I guess we can end on a hopeful note like this, which is to say, our democracy is fraying. The bonds holding us together that were so strong in the mid to late 20th century after World War II and the Cold War, those bonds are weakening. Social media has weakened us. Our country has a lot of problems. Okay, now I said I'd be optimistic. What we're going through now with the coronavirus is the greatest degree of shared adversity we have had since the Second World War, I think. there have been brief things here and there, but 9/11 certainly brought us together. But this is going to go on a long time, and this shared adversity really it seems to, I think it will, bring us together. And if we can have more a sense that we need each other, that we're all in the same boat, then we could return to a time when our moral and political differences are not reasons to write each other off. They're not reasons to hate each other. They're things that will always cause puzzlement and conflict, but sometimes puzzlement and conflict can even be healthy. And so that's my hope, that we'll at least get back to that somewhat, because our democracy has been, in a sense, running outside of its bounds, outside of healthy parameters for a number of years now.
I think that's I think that is a good, helpful understanding as to why you need a diversity of moral understanding. One thing I point out to conservatives is that we wouldn't necessarily be better off if there were no liberals. Okay, liberals do a very good job of pointing out some of these injustices, and now again they change the definition on us quite a bit. But sometimes we should listen. And the problems they're pointing out, as it pertains to a sense of fairness or injustice or a sense of caring, are maybe things that we wouldn't have seen. And they need us to, I think, solve those problems responsibly, because we do care about those other moral foundations, like a sense of authority and rule of law, a sense of in-group loyalty. I think that matters quite a bit when you're talking about sovereignty or borders, or just some of these more basic discussions. I think we find a lot of value in caring about that symbol of the American flag and the Pledge of Allegiance and the national anthem and what that does to us as a country, and actually viewing it as something that has a sense of sanctity. And I think that's good. So in that sense, we do need each other. That's right.
And what you're articulating there is the understanding that I got from reading Edmund Burke, who's one of the obviously one of the patron philosophers of modern conservatism. That Burke did not say we should not change, we should always cling to what is old, but he said we should change carefully. One should, maybe this is a paraphrase, but one should operate on society as one would operate on one's own father. You do have to change, you do have to do things, but you have to be careful. And I think since the French Revolution, progressives have been gung-ho, charged, everything's terrible, let's change it. And conservatives have been saying, not so fast, let's not burn everything down. So the French Revolution didn't end so well. No. But let's hope we're certainly in better balance now.
I'd like to think so, and we could talk for another hour, but I know you've got to go. I really appreciate your time, Jonathan. It's been really fascinating. Again, I'm a huge fan, so it's an honor to have you on.
Oh, well, thank you, Dan. So what an honor to be interviewed by you, to be interviewed by a congressman and a person who's given so much to this country.
I really appreciate it. Well, have a great day and stay healthy.
Thanks. You too, Dan.